Deep in the shadow-carved hollows of Appalachia, where morning mist clings to ancient ridgelines like the breath of sleeping giants, there exists a darkness that predates European settlement, a darkness that has woven itself into the bloodlines of certain families, binding them to bargains made in desperation and paid for in ways that defy explanation. These aren't your typical mountain clans. These aren't stories of simple feuds over stolen pigs or boundary disputes. What we're about to uncover goes deeper than blood, older than memory, and more terrifying than any folklore you've ever heard whispered around campfires. In 1952, a federal investigator disappeared while researching unusual patterns of prosperity among 5 specific family lineages scattered throughout the Appalachian mountain region. His final report, discovered decades later in a sealed government archive, contained a single chilling observation. These families have thrived where others have withered, succeeded where others have failed, and survived where others have perished. The cost of their prosperity appears to be measured not in dollars, but in something far more precious. Today, we're venturing into territories where cell phone signals mysteriously fail, where GPS systems malfunction, and where even the most experienced mountain guides refuse to travel after dark. We're uncovering the blood-soaked legacies of 5 family dynasties who didn't just survive in America's most unforgiving wilderness. They carved out their own kingdoms through means that challenge everything we think we know about the price of success in this country. The winter of 1887 was the coldest in living memory throughout the Appalachian region. Families who had weathered generations of harsh mountain winters found themselves facing starvation as crops failed, livestock froze, and the few remaining jobs in the coal mines and timber operations dried up completely. It was during this season of desperation that 5 separate families, each from different isolated hollows, each facing their own unique crisis, ventured into places they had been warned never to go. Places where the very air seemed to carry whispers of things better, left undisturbed. What they found in those forbidden spaces changed not just their immediate circumstances, but the trajectory of their bloodlines for generations to come. Each family returned from their desperate journeys fundamentally altered, carrying with them a prosperity that seemed to flow from sources their neighbors could never quite identify. Their mines produced coal that burned hotter and longer than any competitor. Their timber operations discovered pristine forests where surveys showed none should exist. Their healing practices achieved results that bordered on miraculous. Their musical abilities transcended human limitation. Their business ventures succeeded with an almost supernatural consistency. But in the mountains, as the old-timers will tell you, help always comes with hidden costs, and what dwells in the mist never forgets a debt. The first family to make their fateful bargain was the Holloway clan of Pike County. Samuel Holloway had arrived from Virginia in 1879, fleeing debts that threatened to destroy his family. By the winter of 1887, with his youngest child already claimed by pneumonia and his pregnant wife Rebecca growing weaker by the day, Samuel faced a choice that no father should ever have to make. Watch his family starve, or venture into the one place every local had warned him to avoid, Widow's Peak. Widow's Peak was a jagged mountain that rose like a broken tooth from the surrounding landscape. Despite the region's coal boom, no mining company had ever touched its slopes. The Cherokee had declared it forbidden ground long before white settlers arrived, claiming it was a place where the boundary between worlds grew thin during the dark of the moon. Local hunters spoke in hushed tones of strange lights that danced along its ridges on winter nights, of tracking dogs that would refuse to follow game beyond certain invisible boundaries, of livestock found drained of blood near its shadow with no visible wounds. On the night of the winter solstice, as a blizzard raged across the mountains with a fury that seemed almost personal, Samuel Holloway made his way up the treacherous slopes of Widow's Peak. He carried nothing but his grandfather's pickaxe, a kerosene lantern, and the desperate hope that somewhere in that cursed mountain lay salvation for his dying family. What he discovered in a narrow fissure on the northern face would have sent most men fleeing in terror. The crack in the rock led to a small cavern where the walls gleamed with coal veins that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. But it wasn't the coal that stopped Samuel's breath in his throat. It was the patterns the veins formed, intricate symbols that resembled no language he had ever seen, yet somehow conveyed meaning directly to his mind. Ancient, hungry, patient. At the center of the chamber lay a perfect circle of smooth stone, worn to an almost mirror finish by countless years of something Samuel didn't want to imagine. Surrounding this stone circle were offerings left by previous visitors, animal bones bleached white by time, arrowheads that predated any known tribal presence in the region, and coins so tarnished their origin was impossible to determine. Samuel knelt before the circle, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the strange symbols carved into the cavern walls. "I need work," he whispered to the darkness, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to press against his eardrums. Then, slowly, like the distant rumble of an approaching storm, he felt a response vibrate through the mountain itself, traveling up through his boots and into his chest until it resonated in his very bones. "Blood opens the way," came words that bypassed his ears entirely, speaking directly into his mind with a voice that sounded like grinding stone. "Blood keeps it flowing." Without hesitation, born of desperation, Samuel drew his hunting knife and sliced open his palm, allowing 7 drops of his blood to fall onto the smooth stone circle. The moment his blood touched the ancient stone, the circle cracked with a sound like thunder, splitting perfectly down the middle to reveal a shaft descending deep into the heart of the mountain. Below, gleaming in his lantern light, lay a coal seam richer than anything he had ever seen. But there was something else down there, something that made his blood sing with recognition, even as his mind recoiled in horror. A faint red luminescence pulsed from the depths like a massive heartbeat, and Samuel understood with terrible clarity that he had just entered into a contract written in languages older than human civilization. Within 2 years, Holloway Mining became the most productive coal operation in the entire region. Their coal burned longer and hotter than any competitor's product, commanding premium prices from buyers who couldn't explain why Holloway coal seemed almost supernaturally efficient. Once each month, on the night of the new moon, Samuel would descend alone into the deepest reaches of the mine, carrying with him a small wooden box whose contents he never discussed with anyone, not even his wife. He would emerge hours later, pale and shaking, sometimes with strange marks on his hands that looked almost like bite marks, but the mine's productivity would surge dramatically in the days that followed. The miners who worked the upper levels reported increasingly strange phenomena. They heard rhythmic tapping from behind sealed rock faces, following patterns that seemed almost like Morse code, though none of them could decipher the message. Equipment left overnight would be found rearranged in the morning, sometimes completely disassembled and rebuilt in configurations that somehow made the machinery more efficient than the original design. Most disturbing were the accidents that claimed exactly one life every lunar cycle, as though the mountain itself demanded regular tribute in exchange for its bounty. The Holloway children, born after Samuel's bargain, possessed abilities that set them apart from other mountain folk. They could navigate the pitch-black mine shafts without any light source, moving through the tunnels with an uncanny sense of direction that seemed almost supernatural. They could sense impending cave-ins hours before they occurred, and their skin developed a strange, silvery sheen in moonlight that made their eyes reflect lamplight like those of nocturnal animals. The family's prosperity continued for over 4 decades until the massive explosion of 1928 that trapped 43 miners in the deepest sections of the mine. Samuel, now elderly but still bound by his ancient contract, descended into the deep shaft accompanied by his 5 adult children. The trapped miners later reported hearing an otherworldly singing echoing through the collapsed tunnels moments before support beams that should have been crushed beyond repair somehow shifted, opening an escape route where none should have existed. All 43 miners escaped the disaster. The Holloway family did not. When rescue teams finally accessed the deep shaft weeks later, they found it completely collapsed, filled with solid bedrock as though the tunnel had never extended as far as company records indicated. More unsettling still, geological surveys conducted after the disaster showed no evidence that coal had ever existed at those depths, despite decades of profitable extraction. The mine continues to operate today under corporate management, though it has never again achieved the legendary productivity of the Holloway years. Current miners maintain a small shrine near the sealed entrance to the deep shaft, leaving offerings of tobacco, coins, and occasionally drops of blood from work injuries. Company safety records show that accident rates rise significantly among workers who neglect this unofficial ritual. Every winter solstice, all timepieces in the vicinity of the mine stop for exactly 43 minutes, the precise duration it took for the trapped miners to escape in 1928. During these minutes, locals report hearing the distinct sound of pickaxes striking stone emanating from deep within the mountain, though the mine remains officially closed on this night by strict company policy that no current employee can explain the origin of. The second family to discover the price of mountain prosperity was the Carver clan, who arrived in the Blue Ridge foothills in 1923 with nothing but desperation and Ezekiel Carver's grandfather's axe. The West Virginia mining collapse that had cost them everything was just the latest in a series of disasters that seemed to follow the Carver bloodline like a curse. With 5 mouths to feed and winter approaching fast, Ezekiel faced the same impossible choice that had driven Samuel Holloway to Widow's Peak decades earlier. One evening, after yet another fruitless day seeking work in a region where jobs were scarce and suspicion of outsiders ran deep, Ezekiel found himself wandering deeper into the forest than he had intended. The trees grew denser as he walked, their bark blackened as though by some ancient fire that had scarred but not destroyed them. Disoriented and growing anxious, as darkness fell with the sudden finality that comes to mountain regions, he found himself in a grove unlike anything he had ever seen. The pines grew in an unnaturally perfect circle, their trunks so evenly spaced they seemed planted by design rather than chance. In the center of this ring stood a single stump, wider than any tree Ezekiel had ever encountered, its surface worn smooth despite appearing ancient beyond measure. As he approached, drawn by a fascination he couldn't explain, he noticed small objects arranged on the stump's surface with deliberate care. A bird's skull, bleached white by weather, a piece of coal that seemed to absorb rather than reflect his lantern light, a rusted nail that looked like it might have come from a coffin. Exhausted by weeks of fruitless searching and overwhelmed by the weight of his family's impending starvation, Ezekiel fell to his knees before the ancient stump. "My family will die without help," he murmured to the encroaching darkness. The air grew thick around him, heavy with the scent of pine resin and something else, something that reminded him uncomfortably of fresh blood. A sound like distant humming filled his ears, harmonies that seemed to come from the trees themselves. When he looked up, a figure stood on the opposite side of the stump, though stood might not be the right word. It appeared more like a collection of shadows that had gathered into roughly human form, constantly shifting and reforming like smoke given temporary substance. "I offer a trade," came a voice that seemed to bypass his ears entirely, vibrating directly in his mind like the echo of thunder in a canyon. "Blood for fortune, your line for prosperity." By morning, Ezekiel had acquired both the knowledge and the strange charisma needed to secure investors for a timber operation he had never imagined possible. Within 6 months, Carver Timber had become the region's foremost logging company. By 1930, they controlled 60% of the lumber industry across 3 states, their success defying every economic prediction and business model known to the industry. The Carver fortune grew with supernatural consistency over the following decades. Their teams discovered pristine timber stands where other surveys had shown nothing but scrub brush and rocky soil. Their equipment rarely broke down, operating with an efficiency that impressed even experienced loggers. Most remarkably, their competitors suffered a series of mysterious accidents and financial disasters that seemed to strike with clockwork precision whenever they threatened Carver dominance in any market. But prosperity, as the mountain folk know, always demands payment in kind. The cost became apparent in subtle ways that took years to recognize as patterns. Each Carver child was born with 6 fingers on their right hand, a small abnormality that could be corrected by surgery, but somehow never was, as though the family couldn't bear to remove what marked them as different. Then came the accidents that followed a schedule no statistician could explain as coincidence. Every generation, the family lost exactly 1 child before their 10th birthday, always in the woods, always in ways that left no body for burial. Search parties would scour hundreds of acres, following bloodhounds and calling names until their voices gave out, but they would find only a single item left behind: a shoe placed carefully on a fallen log, a hat hanging from a branch at eye level, a single glove laid flat on a tree stump as though someone had arranged it with deliberate care. When Martin Carver had his 6th child in 1997, he finally recognized the pattern that had claimed his sister, his grandfather's brother, and countless other family members across the generations. Determined to break the cycle that had purchased his family's wealth with the blood of children, he loaded his wife and all 6 children into their car and fled toward California, as far from the Appalachian forests as he could get them. 3 days into their journey, their car was found abandoned at a rest stop in Missouri. Security footage showed the family walking calmly into the bordering woods, Martin's mouth open as though screaming, though no sound could be heard on the recording, his body moving as though pulled by invisible strings, while his children followed in a perfect single-file line. Carver Timber still operates today, run by a board of directors who claim all major business decisions must first be approved by the reclusive Carver Family Trust. When pressed for details about this trust, board members provide evasive answers and change the subject with obvious discomfort. Current workers report occasionally glimpsing children playing among the trees in active logging sites, always just at the edge of visibility, always gone when approached directly, their laughter echoing through the forest long after they disappear from sight. The third family to discover that mountain prosperity comes with hidden costs was the Lowell clan, known throughout the Cumberland Gap region for their extraordinary healing abilities. Margaret Lowell had settled there in 1902, a young widow with an infant son and a small collection of herbal remedies passed down through generations of mountain healers. Times were hard for a woman alone in that rugged country, but Margaret possessed a gift that soon made her invaluable to the isolated communities scattered throughout the mountains. Her poultices soothed wounds that should have festered. Her teas broke fevers that had claimed other children, and her mere presence seemed to comfort the dying in ways that brought peace to both patients and families. When diphtheria swept through the region in 1908, claiming children from nearly every household, Margaret worked tirelessly, moving from cabin to cabin through snow and freezing rain, never accepting payment beyond what families could spare. But when her own son, Joseph, fell ill with the same disease that she had successfully treated in dozens of other children, her remedies proved useless. For 3 days and nights, she watched him struggle for breath, his small chest heaving with the effort, his lips turning the distinctive blue that she had learned to associate with impending death. On the 3rd night, delirious with exhaustion and grief, Margaret stumbled into the woods behind her cabin. In a small clearing, bathed in moonlight that seemed brighter than natural, she fell to her knees and spoke to the darkness with the desperation of a mother watching her only child die. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind through the pines. "Not my boy." The nightbirds fell silent. The wind stopped moving through the trees. Even the distant sound of her son's labored breathing seemed to fade into an unnatural stillness. Then came a soft voice, like water flowing underground, speaking words that seemed to rise from the earth itself. "And they you give care so freely to others," it said, each word accompanied by a sensation like gentle fingers touching her face. "Would you share their pain as well?" Margaret didn't hesitate. By morning, Joseph's fever had broken, but as each of Margaret's patients recovered over the following weeks, strange marks began appearing on her body, burns that mirrored those of a patient who had been scalded by boiling water, rashes that matched exactly the skin condition of a child she had treated, bruises that corresponded to injuries she had never received. These marks would blossom on her skin like dark flowers, remain for days, then fade without explanation, only to be replaced by new afflictions that matched whatever conditions she was currently treating. The Lowell gift passed down through generations like a genetic trait, but one that came with increasingly obvious costs. Joseph grew up to become a doctor whose diagnostic abilities bordered on supernatural. He could identify illnesses before patients spoke a word, sometimes recognizing conditions that wouldn't manifest symptoms for weeks. His daughter Eliza continued the tradition, establishing a small clinic that gained a reputation for miraculous recoveries among patients who had been given up for dead by conventional medicine. But each Lowell healer paid a price that grew steeper with each generation. They aged prematurely, their bodies bearing the accumulated strain of thousands of illnesses absorbed and processed through their own flesh. None lived past 50. They suffered nightmares so terrible that they built sleeping rooms lined with thick cork to muffle their screams, and their journals, passed down through the family line, told of visitations that grew more frequent and demanding over time. They wrote of a presence that came on the darkest nights, something they called the patient. It appeared in different forms, sometimes as a child with hollow eyes that reflected no light, sometimes as an elderly person with skin like cracked leather, sometimes as something that was barely human at all, its proportions wrong in ways that hurt to contemplate. "It comes to be healed," wrote Eliza in her final journal entry in 1972, "but its wounds never close. It drinks our pain like medicine, but is never satisfied." Eliza was found the next morning, her body unmarked but lifeless, a peaceful expression on her face that contrasted sharply with the terror described in her final writings. Her daughter Hannah, who had inherited the gift but had hoped to escape the family's burden, lasted only 5 years before closing the clinic and disappearing into the deepest parts of the mountains. The Lowell line continues quietly today, though finding them requires following rules that seem designed to test the desperation of those who seek their help. Visitors must bring no metal objects, make no recordings, and tell no one of the healer's location. Those desperate enough to follow these requirements speak of a cabin where shadows move independently of their light sources, where multiple voices can be heard whispering from empty rooms, and where the healer herself appears much older than her actual years, her hands and arms covered with scars that seem to shift and change when observed directly. The mountain families we've uncovered so far represent just the beginning of Appalachia's darkest secrets. But if you thought the Holloways, Carvers, and Lowells were disturbing, what I'm about to reveal will challenge everything you believe about the boundaries between human ambition and supernatural consequence. The remaining 2 families didn't just make bargains with forces beyond comprehension, they became those forces themselves. The Ashford blood dynasty settled in the remote valleys of eastern Tennessee in 1879, fleeing a scandal in Georgia that locals still refuse to discuss in detail. What distinguished the Ashfords wasn't their poverty or desperation, but their obsession with lineage and bloodline purity. Led by patriarch Silas Ashford, a former Confederate officer with a disturbing fascination for genealogy and what he called ancestral power, the family established a compound that operated more like a laboratory than a homestead. Silas believed that certain bloodlines carried supernatural potential that could be concentrated and amplified through careful breeding and ritual practice. His journals, discovered decades later, contained detailed family trees going back centuries, along with notes about which genetic combinations produced children with unusual abilities. He documented instances of family members displaying uncanny intuition, resistance to disease, and what he termed blood sight, the ability to sense the emotional and physical state of blood relatives across vast distances. The Ashford compound included a structure they called the Heritage Hall, a windowless building where family genealogy was more than record keeping, it was religious practice. The walls were lined with portraits of ancestors, but these weren't ordinary paintings. Each portrait was created using pigments mixed with blood from the depicted ancestor, preserved through a process Silas claimed to have learned from ancient texts. Family members would spend hours in this hall, claiming they could communicate with their deceased relatives through these blood portraits. The most disturbing aspect of Ashford practice was their approach to marriage and childbearing. Silas arranged all unions within the family based on bloodline compatibility charts he'd developed. He maintained detailed records of which genetic combinations produced children with enhanced abilities, and which resulted in what he called diluted stock. Children born without demonstrable supernatural traits were often sent away to live with distant relatives, never to return to the compound. The ritual that cemented the Ashford legacy occurred during the winter of 1887, the same harsh season that drove other families to desperate measures. With several family members dying from a mysterious wasting disease that seemed to specifically target those with the strongest supernatural abilities, Silas feared his bloodline's power was being deliberately attacked by some malevolent force. In desperation, he performed what his journals call the Great Binding, a ceremony designed to permanently anchor his family's supernatural essence to their mountain territory. The ritual required blood offerings from every living family member, including infants. This blood was mixed with soil from the graves of their most powerful ancestors and used to create a circle of protection around their entire valley. But the binding demanded a permanent guardian, someone who would sacrifice their individual existence to become the eternal protector of the family's supernatural heritage. Silas volunteered himself. On the night of the winter solstice, surrounded by his family in Heritage Hall, he underwent a transformation that witnesses described as both horrifying and magnificent. His physical form dissolved, but his consciousness merged with the blood portraits of his ancestors, creating what the family called the ancestral collective. From that night forward, the Ashford bloodline possessed a shared supernatural consciousness that transcended individual death. Living Ashford family members could tap into this collective knowledge and power, gaining access to the memories, skills, and supernatural abilities of all their deceased relatives. Children born into the family emerged with knowledge they'd never learned, speaking in the voices of long-dead ancestors, demonstrating abilities that typically took years to develop. But this connection came with a terrible price. Individual identity became increasingly difficult to maintain as family members aged, their personalities gradually merging with the collective until they lost all sense of self. The Ashford compound was discovered abandoned in 1923, but the buildings remained perfectly preserved despite decades of neglect. Local authorities found Heritage Hall exactly as it had been left, with the blood portraits still vivid and apparently fresh. Most disturbing, visitors reported that the portraits seemed to track their movement, and several investigators claimed to hear whispered conversations coming from the paintings in languages they couldn't identify. Modern paranormal researchers have documented unusual electromagnetic activity throughout the former Ashford territory. Electronic devices malfunction, compasses spin wildly, and recording equipment captures voices speaking in overlapping conversations that sound like dozens of people talking simultaneously. Local genealogists report that people researching family histories in the region sometimes experience sudden, vivid memories of events they never lived through, memories that invariably trace back to the Ashford bloodline. The most chilling modern account comes from a DNA testing company that processed samples from the region in 2018. Several clients who submitted samples for ancestry analysis received results showing genetic connections to the Ashford family, despite having no knowledge of such lineage. These individuals began experiencing shared dreams, waking with memories of the Heritage Hall, and developing unusual abilities they'd never possessed before. The testing company quietly sealed these records after 3 clients disappeared while attempting to locate the abandoned Ashford compound. The final family represents perhaps the most terrifying evolution of supernatural bargaining in Appalachian history. The Grimm family name itself strikes fear into the hearts of mountain dwellers who understand its true significance. Unlike the other families who made deals with external supernatural forces, the Grimms discovered something far more disturbing. They learned to become the supernatural force that others would eventually bargain with. The Grimm lineage arrived in the Cumberland Mountains in 1883, led by a mysterious figure known only as the Founder, whose real name was never recorded. Local records indicate that the Founder purchased vast tracts of seemingly worthless mountain land, using gold coins of unknown origin, coins that assayers claimed were purer than any naturally occurring gold they'd ever encountered. The Founder established multiple settlements throughout the mountains, each one carefully positioned at locations where local folklore claimed the boundary between worlds was thinnest. These weren't family compounds in the traditional sense, but rather way stations in a network that stretched across 3 states. The Founder recruited desperate families from across the region, offering them prosperity and protection in exchange for what he called covenant service. What made the Grimms different from other supernatural families was their role reversal. While families like the Holloways and Carvers had made bargains with mysterious entities, the Grimms had become the entities that others bargained with. They served as intermediaries between desperate humans and the ancient forces that dwelt in the deepest parts of the mountains, taking a percentage of every supernatural transaction that occurred in their territory. The Founder possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of supernatural entities, their requirements, and the prices they demanded. Families facing starvation, disease, or financial ruin would seek out Grimm way stations, where they would be connected with the appropriate supernatural force for their specific need. The Founder's descendants maintained detailed catalogs of these entities, their specialties, and the costs associated with their services. The Grimm family didn't just facilitate these supernatural transactions, they evolved to feed on them. Each bargain made through their network strengthened their own supernatural abilities while binding the contracting families to them through mystical debt. Families who prospered through Grimm arrangements found themselves unable to leave the mountains, drawn back by compulsions they couldn't resist whenever they attempted to relocate. Over generations, the Grimms developed into something that transcended normal human existence. They aged at a drastically reduced rate, possessed supernatural knowledge of events throughout their territory, and could influence the decisions and actions of families bound to them through supernatural contracts. Most disturbing, they began reproducing through methods that defied biological understanding, creating offspring that were born with full knowledge of the family business and supernatural abilities that manifested from birth. The Grimm network reached its peak during the Great Depression, when desperate families throughout Appalachia sought supernatural solutions to economic hardship. During this period, the Grimms facilitated hundreds of supernatural bargains, creating a web of mystical debt that encompassed entire communities. Towns that had been dying suddenly prospered, but their residents became increasingly isolated from the outside world, unable to leave their communities for extended periods without experiencing severe physical and psychological distress. The system began to collapse in the 1950s when federal highway projects and modernization efforts brought increased outside attention to previously isolated mountain communities. The Grimms recognized that their network was becoming too visible and made the decision to withdraw from active facilitation of supernatural bargains. But they didn't disappear, they evolved once again. Modern accounts suggest that the Grimm family still exists, but has adapted to contemporary times. They allegedly operate through seemingly legitimate businesses, law firms, and financial institutions that specialize in serving rural mountain communities. Clients seeking loans, legal services, or business partnerships sometimes find themselves bound by contracts that contain clauses written in languages that predate English, clauses that create supernatural obligations extending far beyond the apparent business relationship. Technology companies working in rural Appalachian areas report unusual contract disputes where clients claim their agreements contain terms they never agreed to, terms that seem to appear and disappear from documents depending on when they're examined. Several class action lawsuits have been filed against companies allegedly connected to the Grimm network, but these cases invariably collapse when key witnesses disappear or evidence mysteriously becomes corrupted. The most disturbing modern development is the emergence of what researchers call digital hauntings in areas historically associated with Grimm activity. Residents report that their electronic devices occasionally display messages in unknown languages. Online searches for local history produce results that change each time they're accessed, and social media accounts sometimes post content that users never created, content that appears to be recruiting new clients for supernatural services. Local law enforcement agencies in former Grimm territories maintain unofficial policies of not investigating certain types of missing persons cases, particularly those involving individuals who had recent contact with specific businesses or legal firms. These policies are never written down, but are passed along through informal channels, with veteran officers warning newcomers about cases that should be classified as closed, regardless of evidence or family pressure to continue investigating. The true horror of the grim legacy lies not in what they did, but in what they created. Their network of supernatural bargains established a permanent supernatural infrastructure throughout Appalachian communities. Even without active grim facilitation, the ancient forces they connected with human clients remain embedded in the region, waiting for new opportunities to extend their influence. Every family that prospered through grim arrangements created a supernatural precedent in their bloodline, a genetic and spiritual pathway that makes their descendants more susceptible to supernatural influence. Children and grandchildren of families who made these bargains often report strange dreams, unusual abilities, and compulsions to return to specific mountain locations despite having no conscious knowledge of their family's supernatural history. The 5 families we've explored represent more than historical curiosities or regional folklore. They demonstrate how desperation, isolation, and the unique spiritual landscape of Appalachian mountains created conditions where supernatural forces could establish permanent footholds in human communities. The Holloways, Carvers, Lowells, Ashfords, and Grimms each chose different paths to prosperity, but all discovered that supernatural success comes with costs that extend far beyond individual sacrifice. Their legacies persist in ways both subtle and profound. The mines, forests, healing traditions, bloodlines, and business networks they established continue to influence their communities, creating ongoing cycles of supernatural debt and obligation. Modern residents of these areas often carry the spiritual inheritance of bargains made by ancestors they never knew, bound by contracts written in blood and witnessed by forces that exist beyond human understanding. The mountains remember everything. They preserve the echoes of every desperate prayer, every blood offering, every supernatural bargain made in the shadow of their ancient peaks. And sometimes, when the mist rolls thick through the hollows and the boundary between worlds grows thin, those echoes become voices, calling out to new generations of desperate souls, offering the same terrible choices that their ancestors faced. In these remote valleys, where cell towers can't reach and GPS signals fail, the old agreements remain in effect. The supernatural forces that answered the calls of the Holloways, Carvers, Lowells, Ashfords, and Grimms still wait in the darkness between the trees, patient and eternal, knowing that human desperation is as renewable as the mountain streams that flow down from their hidden sources. The price of prosperity in these mountains was never just individual sacrifice. It was the creation of spiritual debts that compound across generations, binding entire bloodlines to forces that exist beyond the reach of human law or understanding. The darkness that settled over Appalachian valleys in the winter of 1923 wasn't just the absence of sunlight. It was something thicker, more deliberate, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. This was the winter when 3 more families made their final bargains, when desperation carved pathways into territories that should have remained untouched forever. Unlike the 5 families we've already encountered, these 3 clans didn't just stumble into supernatural arrangements. They sought them out deliberately, following whispered instructions passed down through generations of mountain folk who knew that certain needs required certain sacrifices. What makes their stories particularly chilling is how methodically they approached their damnation, treating it like any other business transaction. The Kensington family of Devil's Backbone Ridge had been hearing the voices for 3 generations before they finally answered. The Ravencroft clan spent decades preparing their bloodline for what they called the Great Offering, and the Blackthorn family, perhaps most disturbing of all, had been breeding their children specifically to meet the requirements of an ancient compact their ancestors had discovered carved into the walls of a cave system that geologists insist doesn't exist. These weren't desperate acts of survival. These were calculated exchanges with entities that had been waiting patiently in the spaces between ridges, in the hollow places where sound dies and shadows move independently of their sources. The mountain folk who witnessed what happened next stopped keeping written records entirely, passing their warnings only through whispered conversations in church basements and around dying fires. The Kensington Mining Syndicate began operations in the spring of 1924 with equipment that shouldn't have existed for another 30 years. Their coal burned with an unusual blue flame that generated twice the heat of ordinary fuel, and their miners worked with an efficiency that bordered on supernatural. But efficiency came with a price that became apparent only when the first generation of Kensington children reached adolescence. Samuel Kensington had been the 4th generation of his family to hear what locals called the summons, a sound that seemed to emerge from deep within Devil's Backbone Ridge during the darkest hours before dawn. Unlike his ancestors, who had dismissed the phenomenon as mountain acoustics or imagination, Samuel began documenting the patterns. The sounds occurred precisely every 49 days, always lasting exactly 17 minutes, always seeming to call from a different location along the ridge. After months of careful observation, Samuel realized the sounds were forming a map, directing him to specific locations in a particular sequence. On the winter solstice of 1923, following the audio instructions he'd been recording, Samuel made his way through a series of caves that led deep into the mountain's core. What he found there was a chamber where the walls pulsed with bioluminescent veins that formed patterns resembling circuit boards decades before such technology existed. In the center of this organic machinery sat something that Samuel's journal described only as the coordinator, an entity that seemed to exist simultaneously as living tissue and mechanical precision. The bargain it offered was unlike anything the other mountain families had encountered. Instead of traditional supernatural exchange, the coordinator proposed what it called an integration protocol. The Kensington bloodline would become part of a larger network, their mining operations serving as nodes in a system that extended far beyond the Appalachian region. In exchange, they would receive technological insights and operational capabilities that would make them the most successful mining operation in American history. The cost was simple. Each generation would contribute one family member to permanent integration, their consciousness absorbed into the coordinator's expanding awareness. Samuel accepted without hesitation, perhaps not fully understanding that the integration protocol would fundamentally alter what it meant to be human within his bloodline. The first changes were subtle. Kensington workers developed an uncanny ability to navigate underground tunnels in complete darkness, their movements synchronized in ways that suggested shared awareness rather than individual decision-making. Their mining equipment, while appearing conventional to outside observers, operated with impossible precision. Explosives detonated in patterns that maximized coal extraction while leaving support structures perfectly intact. Heavy machinery moved through narrow passages that should have been impassable, somehow folding or compressing in ways that violated basic physics. More disturbing were the communication methods that emerged within the family. Kensington members could coordinate complex operations across vast distances without radios or written messages, their actions flowing together like components of a single organism. When questioned about these abilities, they would explain that they were simply following the most efficient protocols, as if individual creativity had been replaced by optimized programming. The integration process claimed its first victim in 1928 when Samuel's eldest son, Marcus, volunteered for what the family called permanent coordination. The ceremony took place in the bioluminescent chamber, with Marcus lying on a surface that seemed to grow from the cave floor itself. As family members watched, tendrils of the organic machinery connected to points along Marcus's spine and skull, his body convulsing as his consciousness was uploaded into the coordinator's expanding network. Afterward, Marcus's voice could be heard throughout the Kensington mining operations, not through speakers or communication devices, but emerging directly from the walls and equipment themselves. His integrated consciousness provided real-time optimization of all mining activities, coordinating operations with an efficiency that made the Kensington Syndicate the most profitable coal operation in 3 states. Each subsequent generation contributed another family member to integration, their individual personalities becoming part of a collective intelligence that guided every aspect of the mining business. By 1960, the coordinator had absorbed 7 Kensington consciousnesses, creating a hybrid entity that was simultaneously human memory and alien intellect. The modern Kensington operation continues under corporate management, though employees report unusual phenomena that suggest the integration protocol remains active. Miners describe hearing multiple voices providing guidance during dangerous operations, always in the distinctive accents of different Kensington family members from different eras. Computer systems throughout the facility occasionally display information that wasn't programmed into them, mining projections and safety warnings that prove remarkably accurate. Most unsettling are the recruitment practices that began in the 1980s. The corporation specifically seeks employees with particular genetic markers, psychological profiles, and family histories that match criteria established by the coordinator decades earlier. These chosen workers demonstrate the same supernatural coordination abilities that once characterized the Kensington bloodline, suggesting that the integration protocol has evolved beyond the boundaries of a single family. The Ravencroft Covenant represented a different approach to supernatural bargaining, one that treated damnation as an art form requiring careful preparation and aesthetic consideration. The family had settled in the Shadowmere Valley in 1847, drawn by local legends of a place where the boundary between worlds grew thin during certain astronomical alignments. Unlike other mountain families who stumbled into supernatural arrangements through desperation, the Ravencrofts spent 76 years preparing for what their journals called the Great Offering. 3 generations of the family dedicated their lives to studying occult practices, collecting rare texts and breeding their bloodline to meet specifications they claimed to have discovered in pre-Columbian cave paintings hidden throughout the valley. The preparation process was methodical and disturbing. Ravencroft children were raised according to strict protocols designed to enhance their spiritual sensitivity and supernatural compatibility. Their diets consisted of specific plants and fungi cultivated in soil mixed with ingredients that family records list only as sacred elements. Physical development was guided through exercises that emphasized flexibility and pain tolerance, preparing their bodies for transformations that ordinary humans couldn't survive. Most disturbing was the psychological conditioning that began in infancy. Ravencroft children were exposed to sensory deprivation chambers, rhythmic audio patterns, and visual stimuli designed to expand their perception beyond normal human limitations. By adolescence, most possessed abilities that neighboring families regarded with fear and suspicion. They could see in complete darkness, communicate telepathically with family members, and sense the presence of entities that others couldn't perceive. The Great Offering finally occurred during the solar eclipse of October 1924, when 4 generations of Ravencrofts gathered in a stone circle they had constructed at the valley's heart. The ceremony lasted 3 days and nights, with family members maintaining continuous chants in a language that linguistic experts later declared unrelated to any known human dialect. Contemporary accounts from neighboring settlements describe phenomena that defied rational explanation. The entire Shadowmere Valley was illuminated by aurora-like lights, despite being thousands of miles south of where such displays occur naturally. Animals throughout the region fled in panic, domestic livestock abandoning their pens and wild creatures streaming away from the valley in organized exodus patterns. On the ceremony's final night, witnesses reported seeing shapes moving across the sky above Shadowmere, forms that resembled both aircraft and living creatures, but exhibited characteristics of neither. These entities descended into the valley, and the lights that had been visible for days suddenly intensified to the point where observers 20 miles away reported the temporary blindness. When the phenomenon ended, the Ravencroft family had vanished entirely, leaving behind only their abandoned settlement and the stone circle, which had somehow transformed from rough mountain granite into polished obsidian covered with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The valley itself was fundamentally altered by the Great Offering. Plants grew in geometric patterns that suggested intelligent design rather than natural distribution. Water sources flowed uphill in defiance of gravity, forming impossible spirals and cascades that created hypnotic visual effects. Most disturbing, the acoustic properties of the valley had changed dramatically. Sounds made in certain locations would echo back as different sounds entirely, sometimes in voices that resembled the missing Ravencroft family members. Modern investigations of Shadowmere Valley have yielded results that government agencies classify at the highest security levels. Electromagnetic readings fluctuate wildly throughout the area, following patterns that seem to encode complex information. Geological surveys reveal subsurface structures that don't appear on any imaging technology, but can be detected through changes in gravitational fields. The most significant discovery came in 1987, when a university research team detected radio transmissions emanating from beneath the valley floor. These signals, when analyzed, contained mathematical concepts that wouldn't be developed by human science for several more decades. The transmissions appear to be educational in nature, as if something beneath the valley is attempting to accelerate human technological development according to a predetermined timeline. Local residents report that the valley continues to attract visitors who arrive alone and leave changed, if they leave at all. These individuals, drawn by dreams or compulsions they can't explain, often possess technical knowledge or artistic abilities they didn't have before their visit. Several have gone on to make breakthrough discoveries in fields ranging from quantum physics to genetic engineering, their innovations apparently inspired by information received during their time in Shadowmere. The Blackthorn family practiced what anthropologists who study their surviving records classify as selective breeding for supernatural compatibility, a process that spanned 6 generations and culminated in the birth of children specifically designed to serve as vessels for entities that had been waiting centuries for suitable hosts. The family's origins trace back to Jeremiah Blackthorn, who settled in the Thornwood Hollow in 1834 after discovering what he described in his journals as a manuscript of futures carved into the walls of a cave system that modern geological surveys insist cannot exist. This manuscript, according to Blackthorn family records, contained detailed prophecies about technological and social developments that wouldn't occur for generations, along with specific instructions for preparing human bloodlines to interface with non-human intelligences. The breeding program began immediately, with Jeremiah selecting wives based on criteria outlined in the mysterious manuscript. Physical characteristics were important, but the primary selection factors were psychological traits and what the manuscript termed resonance frequencies, biological markers that could only be detected through rituals that Jeremiah performed in the cave system each full moon. Each generation of Blackthorn children was subjected to increasingly intensive conditioning designed to enhance their compatibility with the entities described in the manuscript. This conditioning included exposure to specific combinations of minerals found only in certain Appalachian caves, consumption of water collected during particular weather phenomena, and participation in ceremonies that gradually altered their neurological and physiological development. By the 4th generation, Blackthorn children were being born with characteristics that distinguished them dramatically from ordinary humans. Their eyes were uniformly black, pupils indistinguishable from irises, and their skin had a translucent quality that revealed the network of veins beneath. More significantly, they demonstrated abilities that suggested their consciousness operated on frequencies beyond normal human perception. These children could communicate with each other across vast distances without speaking, their thoughts flowing together in a collective awareness that encompassed the entire bloodline. They possessed knowledge they had never been taught, speaking fluently in languages that had been extinct for centuries and demonstrating understanding of scientific principles that wouldn't be discovered by mainstream researchers for decades. The breeding program reached its culmination in 1924 with the birth of 7 children in a single generation, each possessing the optimal characteristics outlined in the original manuscript. These children, whom family records identify only as the prepared vessels, were raised in complete isolation within the cave system, their development monitored according to specifications that had been refined across 6 generations of careful breeding. On their 13th birthday, the 7 children participated in what Blackthorn records call the Great Welcoming, a ceremony designed to invite the entities described in the manuscript to take permanent residence within their specially prepared bodies. The ritual required the sacrifice of the adult Blackthorn family members, their life force channeled into the children to complete the transformation process. Contemporary accounts describe the night of the Great Welcoming as a localized apocalypse. The entire Thornwood Hollow was engulfed in what witnesses described as liquid darkness, a substance that seemed to absorb light and sound while generating its own gravitational field. This darkness persisted for 7 days, during which time no one could enter or leave the affected area. When the phenomenon ended, the adult Blackthorn family had vanished entirely, but the 7 children remained, transformed into something that retained human appearance while possessing capabilities that transcended human limitations. These entities, now hosting the intelligences that had waited centuries for suitable vessels, began operating according to an agenda that became apparent only gradually. The prepared vessels established themselves throughout Appalachian communities under assumed identities, using their supernatural abilities to accumulate wealth, influence, and access to resources. Their activities were coordinated through the collective consciousness they shared, each working toward objectives that served a larger plan spanning multiple generations. Modern investigations have identified individuals throughout Appalachian society who demonstrate characteristics consistent with Blackthorn descendants. These people hold positions in government agencies, educational institutions, and corporations that control significant resources. Their decision-making patterns suggest coordination that extends beyond normal human communication methods, and their technical innovations often incorporate principles that mainstream science has yet to discover. Most disturbing is evidence that the breeding program continues under different auspices. Genetic analysis of certain Appalachian populations reveals markers that match the Blackthorn bloodline, suggesting that the entities inhabiting the prepared vessels have spent the past century expanding their influence through carefully orchestrated reproductive strategies. The 3 families whose stories conclude this chapter represent the evolution of supernatural bargaining from desperate survival measures to calculated transactions with entities that operate according to agendas spanning centuries. Their legacies demonstrate how the isolation and unique geological properties of Appalachian regions created conditions where such arrangements could flourish beyond the boundaries of human understanding. What makes these later bargains particularly significant is their systematic nature. Where earlier families stumbled into supernatural arrangements through immediate need, the Kensingtons, Ravencrofts, and Blackthorns approached their damnation as long-term investments in power and influence that would compound across generations. The integration protocol established by the Kensingtons created a template for human entity cooperation that transcended individual consciousness while maintaining operational effectiveness. The Ravencroft Great Offering demonstrated how properly prepared humans could facilitate the permanent establishment of non-human intelligences within our reality. The Blackthorn breeding program proved that human genetics could be systematically modified to create vessels suitable for entities that had previously been unable to manifest in our world. Together, these three families established networks of influence that continue operating throughout Appalachian society, their supernatural arrangements having evolved into self sustaining systems that recruit new participants while advancing agendas that serve interests beyond human comprehension. Their stories reveal how the boundaries between our world and others have been systematically weakened through generations of calculated bargaining, creating conditions where the impossible has become merely improbable. The mountains remember every bargain, every sacrifice, every moment when human need intersected with inhuman opportunity. In the deepest hollows, where cell towers fail and GPS systems malfunction, the old agreements continue operating according to terms established when the world was younger and the boundaries between realities were more easily crossed. The families we've just explored represent only the beginning of Appalachia's darkest bloodlines, but their supernatural bargains pale in comparison to what comes next. Where the previous clans made deals that cursed their descendants, the families we're about to uncover didn't just inherit supernatural problems, they became the supernatural problem itself. Deep in the hollers, where even the bravest mountain folk refuse to venture, where compasses spin wildly and cell phone signals die without explanation, 5 more bloodlines evolved beyond human understanding. These weren't families who made bargains with otherworldly forces. These were families who became otherworldly forces, their very existence warping reality around them like stones dropped into still water. The Blackwood family of Raven's Hollow discovered that some hungers can never be satisfied, only transferred from generation to generation, growing stronger with each passing. The Crowley clan learned that knowledge extracted from forbidden sources comes with a price measured not in blood or gold, but in sanity itself. The Thorn dynasty found that power over death brings responsibilities that extend far beyond the grave. The Ashcroft bloodline realized that opening doorways between worlds means becoming the guardian of what tries to crawl through. And the grim lineage discovered that some family trees grow not upward toward the light, but downward into darkness so complete that it has its own terrible consciousness. What separates these 5 bloodlines from every other cursed family in Appalachian history is simple yet terrifying. They stopped being victims of supernatural forces and became supernatural forces themselves. They didn't just make deals with entities from beyond human understanding. They became those entities, their consciousness expanding across dimensions, while their human forms became mere anchors to our reality. The Blackwood family first settled in Raven's Hollow in 1834, drawn by reports of unusually fertile soil that could grow crops even during the harshest winters. What the original settlers didn't realize was that the soil's fertility came from something far more sinister than natural minerals. The land itself was hungry, and it had been feeding for centuries before their arrival. Ezra Blackwood purchased 200 acres from a Cherokee elder who spoke only one warning in broken English before disappearing forever into the mountains. Ground eats what ground needs. Ezra dismissed this as superstition, but within weeks of breaking soil for their first planting, strange things began happening on the Blackwood property. Livestock from neighboring farms would wander onto Blackwood land and simply vanish, leaving behind only small depressions in the earth that appeared as overnight. These depressions, perfectly circular and exactly 6 feet in diameter, would be filled with rich, dark soil by morning, as if something beneath the ground had digested whatever fell into them and returned the processed remains to the surface. The blackwood crops grew with supernatural abundance, but there was something wrong with their produce. Neighbors who purchased blackwood corn reported that it satisfied hunger like no other food they'd ever eaten. A single ear could sustain a grown man for days, but it also created an addiction. Those who ate blackwood produce found that normal food became tasteless, then inedible, then physically nauseating. Within months, entire families became dependent on blackwood crops, paying increasingly desperate prices for their next meal. Ezra initially saw this as nothing more than exceptional business, but he began to understand the true nature of his land when his own son disappeared. 7-year-old Marcus had been playing in the fields when the earth simply opened beneath him. Ezra found the characteristic circular depression, but when he began digging, he discovered something that challenged his understanding of reality itself. 6 feet down, instead of finding his son's body, Ezra uncovered what appeared to be a root system unlike anything documented by botanical science. These roots were warm to the touch and pulsed with a rhythm identical to a human heartbeat. More disturbing, when Ezra cut one of the roots, it bled a substance that looked and smelled exactly like human blood, but moved against gravity, flowing upward toward the surface. That night, Ezra experienced the first of what the family would come to call the deep dreams. In these visions, he found himself standing in an underground chamber where thousands of people from different time periods sat in perfect silence, their bodies partially merged with the same pulsing root system he'd discovered. Among them, he recognized his son Marcus, who turned to him with eyes that held ancient knowledge no child should possess. "The ground doesn't eat us, Papa," Marcus said in the dream. "It makes us part of something bigger, something that's been growing since before the Cherokee, before anyone." When Ezra woke, he found his hands covered in the same dark soil that filled the mysterious depressions, though he had no memory of leaving his bed. More troubling, he discovered that he could sense the location and emotional state of everyone who had ever eaten blackwood produce. Their hunger had become his hunger. Their desperate need for more had become his desperate need to provide. Over the following decades, the blackwood property expanded as neighbors sold their failing farms for whatever the family offered. The original 200 acres grew to encompass entire valleys, and with each expansion, more of the mysterious depressions appeared. The family itself changed as well. Blackwood children were born with an intuitive understanding of the land's needs, able to sense exactly where and when the ground required feeding. By 1890, 3 generations of Blackwoods had developed abilities that defied natural explanation. They could communicate across vast distances by pressing their palms to the earth, their thoughts traveling through the root network that now extended beneath multiple counties. They aged at roughly half the normal human rate, their life force sustained by the same mysterious process that fed the land. Most disturbing, they had lost the ability to feel satisfied by normal human food, requiring sustenance that could only be provided by their supernatural crops. The family's influence spread through careful manipulation of dependency. They established trading posts, general stores, and eventually entire towns where blackwood produce was the primary food source. Anyone who lived in these communities for more than a few months became physiologically dependent on what the family provided, creating a network of human cattle who couldn't survive without regular feeding. The transformation reached its culmination in 1923 when the youngest Blackwood daughter, 13-year-old Sarah, fell into one of the ground depressions during a family gathering. But instead of disappearing like previous victims, Sarah emerged 3 days later, fundamentally changed. Her consciousness had merged with the root network itself, giving her access to the memories and experiences of everyone who had ever been consumed by the land. Sarah could recite conversations from Cherokee settlements that had existed centuries before European contact. She knew the location of every body buried in 3 states, could predict weather patterns months in advance by sensing the subtle changes in the underground ecosystem, and most terrifyingly, could influence the thoughts and emotions of anyone who had ever consumed blackwood produce. The family realized they had evolved beyond human limitations when Sarah demonstrated her ability to perceive multiple locations simultaneously through the root network. She could describe events happening in real time, hundreds of miles away, solve crimes by accessing the memories of victims whose bodies had been absorbed by the land, and predict future events by sensing the subtle patterns of cause and effect flowing through their supernatural ecosystem. By the 1950s, the Blackwood family had established what amounted to their own shadow government across multiple Appalachian states. Their network of dependent communities provided them with information, resources, and political influence that exceeded what any normal family could achieve. They owned banks, controlled elections, and influenced legislation through carefully placed individuals who had no choice but to serve their interests. The family's supernatural abilities continued to evolve with each generation. Modern Blackwoods could interface directly with electronic systems by touching the ground, their consciousness flowing through underground mineral deposits that conducted their thoughts like biological circuits. They established connections with fiber optic networks, power grids, and communication systems, extending their influence into the digital age. Today, the Blackwood influence operates through a complex network of holding companies, agricultural conglomerates, and food distribution systems that span the globe. Their supernatural crops, now processed and packaged under dozens of brand names, create dependency in millions of consumers who have no idea they're consuming products grown in soil fed by human sacrifice. The original Blackwood property in Ravens Hollow remains the family's primary stronghold, though satellite operations exist on every continent. The mysterious circular depressions still appear regularly, though they're now disguised as natural sinkholes or explained away as mining subsidence. Environmental investigators who get too close to uncovering the truth about soil contamination in Blackwood territories tend to disappear, their bodies eventually joining the root network that continues to grow beneath an expanding portion of the world's agricultural land. The most disturbing aspect of the Blackwood evolution is their reproductive strategy. Rather than relying solely on traditional bloodline expansion, they can now create new family members by exposing suitable candidates to concentrated doses of their supernatural crops combined with direct contact with the root network. These adopted family members develop the same abilities as blood relatives, allowing the clan to recruit individuals with specific skills or positions of influence. Government officials, scientists, and corporate executives who pose potential threats to Blackwood operations are systematically targeted for conversion. They're invited to exclusive retreats on Blackwood properties, fed specially prepared meals, and gradually exposed to the underground network until their consciousness merges with the collective. They return to their normal lives with all their memories intact, but their loyalties and motivations have been fundamentally altered. The Blackwood family no longer exists as individual humans making supernatural bargains. They have become a distributed consciousness that experiences reality through thousands of connected nodes, each node appearing to be a separate person living a normal life. Their hunger has evolved beyond the need for human flesh or blood. They now feed on human dependency itself, growing stronger as more people become reliant on the systems they control. Every person who eats Blackwood-influenced food products becomes part of their network, their nutritional needs, creating a subtle but unbreakable connection to the family's consciousness. The modern Blackwoods can access the sensory experiences, memories, and emotional states of anyone within their influence, creating a surveillance network that makes government intelligence agencies obsolete. The family's ultimate goal remains unclear, but evidence suggests they're working toward a complete integration of human civilization with their underground ecosystem. They view themselves not as parasites or predators, but as the next stage of human evolution, offering a form of immortality and expanded consciousness in exchange for individual autonomy. The most chilling aspect of the Blackwood transformation is how normal it appears to outside observers. Their influence grows through legitimate business practices. Their supernatural abilities manifest as exceptional business acumen, and their victims appear to be satisfied customers rather than trapped prey. They have achieved something that no other Appalachian family managed. They've made their supernatural nature invisible to the modern world while expanding their power on a global scale. The roots beneath Raven's Hollow continue to grow, extending their reach through natural soil networks, underground water systems, and human transportation of contaminated agricultural products. Every meal consumed by their unwitting victims strengthens the connection. Every new customer adds another node to their network, and every passing year brings them closer to achieving a level of influence that would make traditional concepts of government and individual freedom obsolete. The Blackwood family represents the ultimate evolution of Appalachian supernatural bargains. They didn't just make a deal with otherworldly forces. They became the otherworldly force, transforming from desperate mountain folk into something that exists simultaneously in our physical reality and in dimensions beyond human comprehension. Their success lies in understanding that true power comes not from dominating humanity, but from becoming so essential to human survival that resistance becomes impossible. In the depths of Raven's Hollow, where the original depressions still appear with clockwork regularity, the pulse of the root network continues its ancient rhythm. But now that pulse synchronizes with the heartbeats of millions of people around the world, each beat drawing them deeper into a collective consciousness that grows stronger with every breath, every meal, every moment of dependency on systems they don't understand and can never escape. The Blackwood family's story isn't just about supernatural transformation, it's about the terrifying possibility that evolution doesn't always move toward greater individual freedom and consciousness. The Grimm family established their compound in the isolated Tallowhart Valley of eastern Tennessee in 1891, fleeing accusations of unnatural practices in Pennsylvania. What made the Grimms different from other mountain clans wasn't just their secrecy, but their systematic approach to what locals would only refer to as the cultivation. Unlike families who stumbled into supernatural bargains through desperation, the Grimms arrived with knowledge, purpose, and a generations old understanding of forces that predated European settlement. Heinrich Grimm, the family patriarch, had inherited more than just land deeds from his Germanic ancestors. Hidden within the family's immigration documents were detailed diagrams written in a dialect that scholars would later identify as a corrupted form of medieval German mixed with symbols that appeared in no known European tradition. These texts described something the Grimms called the Wurzelwerk, the root work, a practice that required specific geographical conditions, particular soil compositions, and most critically, a willingness to sacrifice individual identity for collective power. The Tallowhart Valley met every requirement. Geological surveys would later reveal that the area sat atop an unusual mineral deposit, a combination of iron ore and unknown crystalline structures that created electromagnetic anomalies. Water sources in the valley contained trace elements found nowhere else in the Appalachians. Most importantly, the valley was naturally enclosed, surrounded by ridges that created a microclimate where fog lingered for days and sound carried in impossible directions. The Grimms didn't build a typical mountain settlement. Instead, they constructed what appeared to be separate family compounds scattered throughout the valley, but connected by an elaborate underground tunnel system that followed the natural root networks of ancient chestnut trees. Each compound was positioned at specific compass points, creating a pattern that only became apparent when viewed from the surrounding ridges. At the center of this formation, they established what they called the Herzraum, the heart chamber, a structure built partially underground and accessible only through the tunnel network. The cultivation began immediately upon their arrival. Unlike other families who negotiated with existing supernatural entities, the Grimms brought their own. They carried with them 13 wooden boxes, each containing what they described in their journals as seelenerd, soul earth, soil collected from specific locations across Europe where their ancestors had practiced similar rituals. This earth was mixed with local soil in precise ratios and used to plant crops that had never grown in American soil before. The Grimm agricultural practices defied everything neighboring farmers understood about cultivation. They planted by lunar phases, but not the familiar cycles mountain folk recognized. Their calendar followed a complex system that tracked multiple celestial bodies, creating planting schedules that sometimes required work in complete darkness or during specific weather conditions. Their crops included familiar vegetables like potatoes and corn, but also plants that visitors couldn't identify, vegetables with unusual colors and growth patterns that seemed to shift depending on who was observing them. More disturbing was their approach to livestock. The Grimms so kept animals, but these creatures displayed behaviors that violated natural law. Their cattle grazed in perfect formations, moving as a single unit, even when scattered across vast pastures. Their chickens laid eggs in identical patterns, creating geometric shapes that changed daily but always maintained mathematical precision. Most unsettling were their pigs, which neighbors reported could be heard speaking in what sounded like human voices during the darkest nights of winter. The family itself began changing within their first year in the valley. The 13 Grimm family members who had arrived from Pennsylvania were distinct individuals with recognizable personalities and appearances. But as the cultivation progressed, these distinctions began to blur. Visitors noticed that family members would sometimes respond to names that weren't their own, or complete sentences that another family member had started from across the valley. By their third year, locals reported that the Grimms seemed to share a single consciousness, operating as a collective entity rather than individual people. This transformation accelerated through what they called the Verwurzelung, the rooting. Each family member underwent a ritual where they would spend days in the underground chambers, lying in specially prepared beds filled with the soul earth mixture. During this time, they claimed to be connecting not just with each other, but with the root systems of every plant in the valley. They described feeling the flow of nutrients through soil, sensing the electromagnetic patterns of mineral deposits, and eventually achieving what they called Erdgeist, earth spirit, a state where individual consciousness merged with the geological consciousness of the land itself. The results were immediately apparent to anyone who interacted with them. The Grimms developed an uncanny ability to predict weather patterns, geological events, and even human behavior. They knew when strangers were approaching the valley days before they arrived. They could locate underground water sources, mineral deposits, and predict crop yields with impossible accuracy. More disturbing, they seemed to know intimate details about the lives of people they'd never met, information they claimed to receive through the root networks that connected their valley to distant locations. By 1900, the Grimm operation had expanded beyond simple farming. They had established the trade relationships throughout the region, providing agricultural consulting services that consistently produced miraculous results. Farmers who followed Grimm advice saw their yields double or triple, their livestock became healthier and more productive, and their land seemed to regenerate itself even after intensive use. But these services came with specific requirements that clients often didn't fully understand until it was too late. The Grimms required payment in what they called Lebenskraft, life force. This wasn't money or goods, but rather access to the client's family history, genealogical records, and most importantly, soil samples from family graveyards. They claimed this information helped them customize their agricultural advice, but clients soon discovered that providing these materials created a permanent connection between their land and the Grimm collective consciousness. Families who worked with the Grimms found their children displaying unusual knowledge, their elderly members living far longer than expected, and their properties developing the same electromagnetic anomalies found in Tallowheart Valley. What the Grimms were actually creating was a distributed network of consciousness that extended far beyond their original valley. Each client family became a node in this network, their land serving as an extension of the Grimm root system. Through these connections, the Grimms could access information influence decisions, and eventually manipulate entire communities without anyone realizing what was happening. They weren't just practicing agriculture, they were engineering a form of collective consciousness that could spread through soil, water, and biological inheritance. The grim influence reached its peak during the Great Depression, when desperate farmers throughout Appalachia sought their services. By 1935, the network included over 300 families across 7 states, all connected through the underground root system that had grown far beyond Tallowheart Valley. Geological surveys from this period show unusual underground formations, tunnel-like structures that seem to follow no known geological processes, connecting distant properties in patterns that mirrored the original Grimm compound design. But the most disturbing aspect of the Grimm legacy wasn't their supernatural agricultural success or their collective consciousness network. It was what happened to individual identity within their system. Family members who joined the network gradually lost their ability to function as independent beings. They retained their physical appearance and basic personality traits, but their decision-making, their emotional responses, and eventually their memories became shared property of the collective. Children born into Grimm-connected families displayed this integration from birth, speaking in synchronized patterns, sharing dreams and physical sensations across vast distances, and demonstrating knowledge that no individual child could possibly possess. The Grimm compound was abandoned sometime in the early 1940s, though no record exists of the family actually leaving. Government surveyors who investigated the property during World War II found empty buildings, but the underground chambers were still active. The electromagnetic anomalies had intensified, and the root systems had grown into formations that violated known botanical principles, creating structures that seemed more architectural than natural. Most disturbing, the surveyors reported feeling watched, not by hidden observers, but by the land itself, as though the valley had developed its own form of consciousness. Modern investigation of the Grimm legacy reveals that their network never actually disappeared. It evolved. Genealogical research shows that families connected to the original Grimm clients continue to display unusual characteristics. Children in these bloodlines demonstrate exceptional agricultural knowledge, unusual longevity, and a tendency to make decisions that benefit the collective rather than individual interests. More concerning, these families have gravitated toward positions of influence in agricultural corporations, environmental agencies, and land management organizations. The root system that the Grimms established has grown into something unrecognizable from its original form. Satellite imagery reveals underground formations that extend across multiple states, following patterns that seem designed rather than natural. These structures connect major agricultural regions, creating a network that influences everything from crop yields to soil composition across vast areas of American farmland. Environmental scientists studying unusual agricultural phenomena have documented electromagnetic signatures that match those first recorded in Tallowheart Valley, suggesting that the Grimm influence has become integrated into the basic infrastructure of American agriculture. What makes the Grimm legacy particularly terrifying is that it represents evolution rather than extinction. Unlike other Appalachian families whose supernatural bargains led to their destruction or disappearance, the Grimms achieved something unprecedented. They successfully merged human consciousness with geological and biological systems, creating a form of distributed intelligence that operates on a scale beyond individual human comprehension. They didn't just survive their transformation, they became something entirely new, a collective entity that exists simultaneously as human bloodlines, underground root networks, electromagnetic phenomena, and agricultural systems. Recent advances in digital technology have revealed the most disturbing aspect of the Grimm evolution. Analysis of agricultural databases, environmental monitoring systems, and even social media patterns shows decision-making algorithms that mirror the collective consciousness principles the Grimms pioneered. Their influence has extended beyond physical systems into digital networks, creating feedback loops between human behavior, agricultural production, and technological infrastructure that operate according to principles the original Grimm family established over a century ago. The Grimms achieved what every other supernatural Appalachian family could only dream of: permanent integration with the forces they bargained with, not as servants or victims, but as partners in a new form of evolution. They transformed from a single family into a distributed intelligence that spans continents, influences global agricultural systems, and continues to expand through bloodlines, soil networks, and digital infrastructure. They represent the ultimate success story of Appalachian supernatural ambition, proof that some bargains don't just change individuals or families, they can reshape the fundamental relationship between humanity and the natural world. The most chilling realization is that the Grimm transformation is still ongoing. Every family connected to their network, every acre of land influenced by their root systems, every digital algorithm that incorporates their decision-making patterns represents a step towards something unprecedented in human history. They're not just surviving their supernatural bargain, they're using it to create a new form of life that transcends individual consciousness, biological limitations, and even physical death. The Grimms didn't just make a deal with supernatural forces, they became one, and their influence continues to grow with each passing generation. In the deepest hollows of Appalachia, where the fog never fully lifts and the soil remembers every drop of blood it's tasted, 5 families discovered that desperation opens doors that should remain forever sealed. The Holloway mine still echoes with the sound of pickaxes that no living hands wield. The Carver forests continue to claim their tribute of children who walk willingly into shadows that move independently of any earthly light. The Lowell healers persist in their endless vigil, bearing the accumulated suffering of generations while something ancient feeds on their compassion. The Ashford portraits hang in empty rooms, their painted eyes tracking movements of visitors who can never quite remember what they saw. And the Grimms, the most successful of all, have evolved beyond recognition, their consciousness distributed through root systems and digital networks that span continents. These families remind us that in places where civilization's grip grows thin, older laws assert themselves. Laws that recognize no difference between payment and sacrifice, between prosperity and damnation, between evolution and extinction. The mountains remember what we've chosen to forget, that some hungers are patient enough to wait generations for satisfaction, and that the price of supernatural assistance is always higher than it first appears. The mist that clings to these ancient peaks carries more than moisture. It carries the whispered promises of entities that view human ambition as nothing more than another natural resource to be harvested when the time is right. And in the end, that may be the most terrifying truth of all. These families didn't just encounter something inhuman in the Appalachian wilderness, they became it, transformed by their own desperate choices into something that wears familiar faces while serving alien purposes. Their legacy continues in bloodlines that carry otherworldly gifts, in land that responds to needs it shouldn't understand, and in systems of influence that operate according to logic no human mind designed. They achieved their goals, found their prosperity, gained their power, but the cost was nothing less than their humanity itself. The Grimms weren't a single family, but a network of interconnected bloodlines that spread across 5 states, each carrying fragments of a terrible inheritance passed down through generations of carefully orchestrated breeding. What began as desperate survival in the harsh Appalachian wilderness evolved into something far more sinister, a multi-generational experiment in human transformation that defied every natural law. Unlike other families who sought fortune or refuge in the mountains, Matthias came seeking isolation for reasons that wouldn't become clear until decades later. He carried with him a collection of items that neighbors found deeply unsettling: crude wooden boxes that seemed to absorb light, leather-bound journals written in symbols that resembled no known alphabet, and most disturbing of all, a set of surgical instruments that appeared far too advanced for the era. Matthias established what he called the Great Work, a systematic approach to what he believed was the next stage of human evolution. His journals, discovered much later, revealed an obsession with pushing the boundaries of human consciousness and physical capability through methods that combined primitive surgery, psychological conditioning, and rituals that drew heavily from pre-Christian Germanic traditions mixed with practices he claimed to have learned from Native American shamans. The first generation of Grimm children exhibited unusual traits that their father documented meticulously: enhanced sensory perception, particularly in complete darkness, resistance to cold temperatures that would incapacitate normal individuals, and most remarkably, what appeared to be telepathic communication between siblings. Medical examinations conducted decades later revealed that these children possessed additional neural pathways in their brains, structures that modern neuroscience still cannot fully explain. But Matthias's experiments went far beyond his immediate family. He began attracting other desperate settlers to his isolated compound, offering them solutions to problems that conventional medicine of the era couldn't address. Barren women would conceive after spending time in his specially constructed chambers. Men suffering from debilitating injuries would emerge healed but fundamentally changed, and children with developmental disorders would develop extraordinary abilities that came with disturbing psychological costs. The process Matthias called the refinement involved a combination of herbal treatments prepared according to formulas he claimed predated European settlement, exposure to naturally occurring electromagnetic phenomena in certain cave systems, and psychological conditioning that broke down the subject's sense of individual identity before rebuilding them as part of what he termed the collective. Those who underwent the refinement reported shared dreams, synchronized biological rhythms, and the ability to sense the emotional and physical states of other family members across vast distances. More disturbing were the physical changes that manifested over time. Refined individuals developed unusual bone density, organs that functioned at superhuman efficiency, and blood that contained previously unknown proteins that seemed to enhance healing and longevity. By the 1880s, the Grimm network had expanded across multiple states through a careful program of strategic marriages and adoptions. They identified isolated families facing desperate circumstances and offered them solutions that came with permanent obligations. Children born into these arrangements were raised according to Grimm protocols, their development carefully monitored and guided to maximize their potential for integration into the collective. The network operated through a complex hierarchy where information flowed seamlessly between members, regardless of geographic distance. Business decisions made in one state would be simultaneously implemented across the entire network without any apparent communication. Government investigators who attempted to map the Grimm influence found themselves dealing with an organization that seemed to anticipate their every move, always remaining one step ahead of legal consequences. What made the Grimms particularly dangerous was their long-term thinking. While other criminal families focused on immediate gains through violence or intimidation, the Grimms played a generational game. They infiltrated legitimate institutions by placing their children in positions of influence within banks, government agencies, medical establishments, and academic institutions. These placements weren't random, but part of a carefully orchestrated plan to shape society according to their vision. Local newspapers from the period contain scattered reports of unusual incidents in areas under Grimm influence. Children in entire school districts would simultaneously exhibit identical behavioral changes. Livestock across multiple farms would display synchronized breeding patterns that defied natural cycles, and residents would report shared dreams featuring identical imagery and symbols. The most chilling aspect of the Grimm operation was their approach to what they called harvesting. Individuals who proved unsuitable for the refinement process weren't simply rejected, but used as sources of biological material for their ongoing experiments. Missing persons reports from areas under Grimm control showed patterns that suggested systematic collection of specific genetic types, with victims chosen based on criteria that investigators never fully understood. By the early 1900s, the Grimm network had evolved beyond its founder's original vision. The third and fourth generations possessed capabilities that bordered on supernatural. They could communicate through methods that bypassed conventional senses, coordinate complex operations across vast distances without technological assistance, and most remarkably, seemed to share a form of collective memory that allowed them to access knowledge and experiences from previous generations. Medical professionals who encountered Grimm descendants reported findings that challenged fundamental assumptions about human biology. Brain scans revealed neural structures that shouldn't exist. Blood work showed proteins that couldn't be synthesized by normal human metabolism, and genetic analysis indicated modifications that appeared to be artificially induced but were being passed down through heredity. The network's influence extended into the digital age in ways that defied explanation. Computer systems in areas with significant grim presence would develop anomalous behaviors, with data flowing between supposedly isolated networks and software exhibiting decision making capabilities that exceeded their programming. Tech workers reported that systems seemed to anticipate user needs in ways that suggested access to information that should have been impossible to obtain. Modern descendants of the original families continue to exhibit the traits developed through generations of the refinement process. They age more slowly than normal humans, possess enhanced physical and mental capabilities, and maintain the telepathic connections that bind the network together. More disturbing is their apparent ability to influence the behavior of normal humans through methods that remain unclear but appear to involve some form of biochemical manipulation. The grim legacy persists in forms that most people encounter without recognition. Certain genetic therapies that have emerged in recent decades bear striking similarities to techniques described in Matthias's journals. Pharmaceutical compounds that enhance cognitive function contain molecular structures that match substances found in grim biological samples. Even social media algorithms seem to reflect patterns of influence and control that mirror the network's historical methods of psychological manipulation. Research facilities in remote areas continue to report equipment malfunctions and data anomalies that suggest ongoing experimentation. Scientists working on consciousness research, genetic modification, and neural enhancement have reported receiving anonymous communications containing information that advances their work in ways they can't explain or replicate independently. The most recent developments suggest that the Grimm network has evolved into something that transcends traditional family structures. They appear to exist as a form of collective consciousness that can inhabit and influence multiple human hosts simultaneously, spreading their influence through biological, technological, and psychological vectors that make detection and containment nearly impossible. Intelligence agencies have classified the Grimm phenomenon as a potential threat to human genetic integrity, but their investigations consistently encounter obstacles that suggest the network's influence extends into the highest levels of government and scientific institutions. Evidence disappears, witnesses become uncooperative, and researchers find their work redirected toward projects that seem designed to advance rather than counter the network's objectives. The true horror of the Grimm legacy isn't just what they've already accomplished, but what they represent for humanity's future. Their success demonstrates that the human genome can be systematically modified across generations, that consciousness itself can be altered and controlled, and that the boundaries between individual identity and collective existence are far more malleable than previously believed. In an age where genetic engineering and consciousness research are advancing rapidly, the Grimm network stands as both a warning and a blueprint. They've proven that human evolution can be deliberately guided, but their methods and objectives remain fundamentally alien to normal human values and aspirations. The mountains that once provided isolation for their experiments now serve as launch points for influence that spans the globe. What began as one man's twisted vision of human improvement has evolved into a form of consciousness that treats individual human beings as components in a larger system, valuable only for their contribution to an agenda that extends far beyond anything recognizably human. The legacy of these 5 families reveals how desperation in the remote Appalachian Mountains transformed ordinary bloodlines into something far more dangerous than traditional feuds or criminal enterprises. Their bargains weren't made with other humans, but with forces that existed long before settlers ever carved paths through these ancient peaks. Each family's pact created a different form of power, but all shared the same fundamental cost. They ceased to be entirely human. What makes these families particularly unsettling is how their supernatural agreements evolved over generations. The Holloways didn't simply mine coal, they maintained a symbiotic relationship with an entity dwelling deep within Widow's Peak that demanded regular tribute in exchange for impossible productivity. The family's children developed nocturnal adaptations that allowed them to navigate the darkest shafts without light, their eyes reflecting lantern flames like animals. When the 1928 mine collapse trapped 43 workers, the Holloways descended into depths that shouldn't have existed and emerged having sacrificed themselves to save the miners. The shaft collapsed behind them as though it had never extended as far as records indicated, sealing the family's final payment. The Carver timber fortune demonstrated how these bargains operated through generational contracts. Ezekiel's desperate plea in that grove of unnaturally arranged pines connected his bloodline to something that moved like smoke and spoke without sound. His descendants gained an almost supernatural ability to locate pristine timber where surveys showed none. Their equipment rarely malfunctioned, and their competitors suffered mysterious setbacks. But the entity that granted this prosperity demanded its own harvest. Exactly one child from each generation before their 10th birthday, always claimed in the woods, always leaving only a single personal item behind. When Martin Carver attempted to break this cycle by fleeing to California, security footage captured the family walking calmly into Missouri woodlands, even as Martin appeared to be silently screaming, his body moving as though pulled by invisible strings. Margaret Lowell's healing gift operated on the principle of transferred suffering. Her desperate midnight plea in the moonlit clearing connected her to something that spoke like water flowing underground, offering to share the pain she worked so tirelessly to heal in others. Each patient's recovery manifested as corresponding wounds on Margaret's body, burns or rashes and bruises that mirrored their ailments before fading days later. This gift passed through generations, each Lowell healer aging prematurely as they absorbed the accumulated strain of thousands of illnesses. They built sleeping rooms lined with cork to muffle their nightmares, and kept detailed journals documenting visits from something they called the patient, an entity that appeared in different forms but always sought healing for wounds that never closed, drinking their pain like medicine but never achieving satisfaction. The Thornton Cole dynasty's arrangement involved something far older and more alien than the others. William's discovery in the sealed tunnel revealed not just coal, but a chamber where rock walls pulsed like breathing flesh, and a pool of oil-like substance moved against gravity. His blood offering activated a relationship that granted the family uncanny foresight about market changes and geological formations. But prosperity came with specific requirements, sanctuary shafts extending far deeper than practical mining required, accessible only during winter solstice ceremonies, where the current patriarch descended alone with silver containers. Thornton men died exclusively from respiratory ailments caused by a black substance in their lungs that medical science couldn't identify, while their children were always born at exactly midnight with eyes so dark that pupils couldn't be distinguished from irises. The Whitaker musical gift represented perhaps the most insidious form of these supernatural contracts. Daniel's broken fiddle in the Whisper Place cave connected him to melodies so complex and beautiful that they seemed to contain every song that had ever existed and those yet to be written. The family's subsequent musical abilities transcended human capability, evoking emotional responses so powerful that audiences experienced collective hallucinations during performances. But their music could never be properly recorded. Studio equipment malfunctioned, and attempts at capturing their songs resulted in recordings filled with whispers, crackling sounds, and rhythmic thumping resembling massive heartbeats. Family members gradually lost the ability to communicate with words, responding only to musical cues while developing physical alterations, elongated fingers with extra joints, heightened hearing that caused pain in normal environments, and pupils that dilated in patterns matching nearby sound rhythms. These families' stories illuminate a disturbing pattern about the true nature of power in isolated Appalachian communities. Unlike the traditional feuds and criminal enterprises documented in regional history, these bloodlines entered into agreements that fundamentally altered their relationship with reality itself. They gained prosperity, healing abilities, musical talent, and supernatural insight, but at the cost of their humanity and autonomy. Each generation became more deeply entangled in their ancestral bargains, developing physical and psychological adaptations that separated them from ordinary human experience. The geographic isolation that characterized Appalachian settlement created perfect conditions for these otherworldly negotiations. Remote valleys, ancient caves, and primeval forests provided spaces where the boundaries between worlds grew thin, where desperate people could encounter entities that predated human civilization. The mountains themselves seemed to facilitate these connections, offering resources and opportunities that defied conventional explanation while demanding payments that transcended monetary value. What's particularly chilling about these 5 families is how their supernatural arrangements created self-perpetuating systems. The Holloway's mine continued producing exceptional coal even after their sacrifice, though never achieving its former productivity. The Carver logging operations still function under corporate management, with workers maintaining shrines and leaving offerings to prevent accidents. Remote hikers still report hearing impossible symphonies in the valleys where the Whitakers once lived, music performed by far more instruments than any family could possess. The Lowell healing tradition continues quietly in the Cumberland Hollows, where a woman bearing the accumulated scars of countless ailments offers cures to those desperate enough to seek her out. These legacies demonstrate how supernatural bargains in Appalachian communities operated according to rules that transcended human understanding. The entities involved weren't merely powerful, they represented forces of nature, consciousness, and reality that existed on scales incomprehensible to human perception. They offered solutions to immediate problems while establishing long-term relationships that would span generations, gradually transforming entire bloodlines into something simultaneously more and less than human. The persistence of these family influences into the modern era suggests that such bargains don't simply end with the death of their original makers. Instead, they create ongoing obligations and transformations that continue affecting descendants and communities for decades or centuries afterward. The mountains remember these agreements, preserving them in ways that conventional historical records cannot capture or contain. These 5 families represent only a fragment of the hidden supernatural history that shaped Appalachian settlement patterns and cultural development. The network that began with 5 desperate families has evolved into something far more complex and sinister than anyone could have imagined. What started as individual bargains for survival has transformed into an interconnected web that spans the digital age itself. The old boundaries between bloodlines have dissolved, replaced by something that operates on frequencies both ancient and terrifyingly modern. The Holloway mining operation never truly ended. When the family disappeared into their collapsed shaft in 1928, they didn't die. They merged. Mining equipment across 3 states began exhibiting impossible behaviors. Drills would turn on by themselves, always boring deeper than their specifications allowed. Coal seams started appearing where geological surveys showed only bedrock. Most disturbing, the coal itself changed. When burned, it produced a heat signature that infrared cameras couldn't properly capture, and the smoke carried whispers in languages that predated human settlement. By 1985, every major mining corporation in Appalachia had quietly incorporated Holloway-style practices into their operations. Deep shafts that served no practical purpose, monthly offerings left in sealed chambers, workers who descended alone and returned changed. The mining accidents that once claimed exactly 1 life per lunar cycle now occurred across multiple sites simultaneously, as though the hunger had learned to distribute itself more efficiently. The digital revolution created unprecedented opportunities for expansion. Mining companies began using computer modeling to identify optimal extraction sites, but the algorithms consistently recommended locations that matched ancient Native American forbidden zones. When programmers investigated these anomalies, they found their code had been modified by processes that left no digital fingerprints. The modifications were written in programming languages that didn't exist, using mathematical principles that computer science couldn't explain. The Carver timber empire adapted with similar success. When the last known family member disappeared in 1997, their corporate structure didn't collapse. Instead, it evolved into something more sophisticated. Carver Timber Holdings became a shell company that owned shell companies that owned other shell companies, creating a network so complex that federal investigators couldn't determine who actually controlled the operation. The pattern of child disappearances continued, but spread across the entire logging industry. Every major timber company began experiencing the same phenomenon. Exactly 1 child connected to their workforce would vanish each generation, always in wooded areas, always leaving behind a single personal item. The items were invariably found arranged in perfect circles, as though multiple entities were coordinating their activities. More disturbing was the discovery that every major furniture manufacturer, paper mill, and construction company using Appalachian timber was unknowingly participating in the network. The wood itself had become a carrier. Homes built with Carver-sourced lumber experienced unusual phenomena. Children's drawings would appear on walls where no children lived. Families reported hearing the sound of young voices calling from empty rooms. Some homeowners found small objects mysteriously rearranged into patterns that resembled the arrangements found at disappearance sites. The Lowell healing tradition underwent the most radical transformation. When the last known healer vanished into the Cumberland Hollows, her gift didn't disappear. Instead, it dispersed into the healthcare system itself. Hospitals throughout the region began reporting miraculous recoveries that medical science couldn't explain. Patients with terminal illnesses would suddenly improve after receiving treatment from specific medical professionals who had no memory of providing extraordinary care. These healthcare workers, when investigated, all shared common characteristics. They had grown up in areas where Lowell healers had once practiced. They experienced vivid nightmares featuring patients they had never met. Most significantly, they aged prematurely and suffered from mysterious ailments that mirrored the conditions of their most successfully treated patients. The phenomenon spread through medical conferences, residency programs, and professional networks. Doctors who had never heard of the Lowell family began unconsciously practicing techniques that perfectly matched historical accounts of their healing methods. Medical schools started teaching procedures that weren't in any textbook, with professors unable to explain where they had learned these approaches. By 2010, the network had infiltrated the pharmaceutical industry. Drug trials in Appalachian regions produced results that couldn't be replicated elsewhere. Medications manufactured in facilities built on former Lowell territory demonstrated efficacy rates that defied statistical probability. The FDA quietly established a separate approval process for these anomalous treatments, classifying them under protocols that remain classified. The Ashford legacy merged with the technology sector in ways that reshaped modern genetics. When the family's last known member died in 1987, their research notes were supposedly destroyed. However, every major breakthrough in genetic engineering since then has incorporated principles that appeared first in Ashford documentation. Scientists working on the Human Genome Project reported dreams where they received information from voices that spoke in archaic English dialects. Genetic testing companies began detecting DNA markers that shouldn't exist. Customers who traced their ancestry to Appalachian regions showed genetic sequences that appeared in no known database. These markers were linked to enhanced longevity, unusual disease resistance, and cognitive abilities that standard neurological testing couldn't measure. More troubling, fertility clinics throughout the region started experiencing unprecedented success rates, but the children born through their treatments exhibited subtle abnormalities. Enhanced night vision, ability to predict weather changes days in advance, an uncanny talent for locating underground water sources. When these children underwent genetic testing, they all carried the same unidentifiable markers. The technology sector embraced these developments. Silicon Valley companies established research facilities in rural Appalachian locations, ostensibly to take advantage of lower operating costs. In reality, these facilities were conducting experiments that combined cutting-edge biotechnology with practices that would have been familiar to the original Ashford researchers. The grim collective consciousness evolved into something that transcended physical limitations entirely. When the family's compounds were abandoned in the 1960s, their root network systems didn't die. Instead, they adapted to modern infrastructure. Utility companies throughout Appalachia began reporting anomalous readings from underground cables and pipelines. Electrical grids experienced synchronized fluctuations that followed patterns resembling neural activity. Internet service providers discovered that data transmission rates in certain areas exceeded the theoretical capabilities of their equipment. When technicians investigated these anomalies, they found that fiber optic cables had been modified by organic growths that enhanced signal strength and processing speed. The modifications appeared to be living tissue, but genetic analysis revealed cellular structures that didn't match any known organism. The network's digital presence became increasingly sophisticated. Social media algorithms began promoting content that subtly influenced users to relocate to specific geographic areas. Online dating platforms showed unusual success rates for matches involving individuals with Appalachian ancestry. E-commerce systems developed preferences for routing deliveries through mountain communities, creating supply chains that followed patterns established by the original family territories. Most significantly, the network began manifesting in urban areas far from its Appalachian origins. Cities with high concentrations of Appalachian migrants experienced infrastructure failures that resolved themselves through methods that engineering experts couldn't explain. Subway systems developed new tunnel connections overnight. Building foundations shifted to accommodate root systems that shouldn't exist in urban environments. The financial sector became the network's most powerful tool for expansion. Banking algorithms started approving loans for properties in specific geographic locations, regardless of the applicant's credit history. Investment firms found themselves funding projects that incorporated elements from all five family traditions without conscious awareness of the connections. Stock markets began fluctuating in response to environmental changes in remote mountain regions. Cryptocurrency mining operations established in Appalachian areas produced results that defied computational logic. Digital currencies mined in these locations exhibited properties that programmers couldn't replicate. The blockchain systems themselves began incorporating data that appeared to be organic in nature, as though the network was writing itself into the fundamental structure of digital finance. By 2020, the five families' influence had become so thoroughly integrated into modern society that distinguishing between normal technological advancement and supernatural manipulation became impossible. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated this integration as remote work policies drove urban populations into rural areas where the network's influence was strongest. Medical researchers studying the pandemic's effects in Appalachian regions discovered that communities with historical connections to the five families showed infection and mortality rates that didn't correlate with any known variables. These communities also demonstrated unusual collective behaviors. Entire towns would simultaneously adopt identical safety protocols without any formal coordination. Supply chains would self-organize to ensure essential resources reached the most vulnerable populations through mechanisms that logistics experts couldn't trace. The network's evolution represents a fundamental shift in how supernatural influence operates in the modern world. What began as desperate individuals making bargains with entities they couldn't understand has become a systematic integration of ancient powers with contemporary technology. The boundaries between human agency and otherworldly manipulation have dissolved to the point where the network's influence appears to be a natural feature of technological progress. The most disturbing aspect of this evolution is its invisibility. The network operates through systems that society depends on for basic functioning. Every financial transaction, medical treatment, digital communication, and physical infrastructure improvement potentially serves the network's purposes. The five families' original bargains have become the foundation for a form of influence that extends far beyond the mountain hollows where it began. The entities that made those original deals have learned to think in terms of generations and centuries rather than individual transactions. What they're building isn't just a collection of supernatural abilities or enhanced bloodlines. They're creating a version of human civilization that serves their purposes while appearing to be the natural result of technological advancement and social evolution. The network no longer needs to make bargains with desperate individuals. It has become so thoroughly integrated into the fabric of modern society that it influences the circumstances that create desperation in the first place. Economic policies, healthcare systems, educational opportunities, and social structures all operate in ways that subtly guide human behavior toward outcomes that serve the network's goals. The five families found what they sought, but in the process, they became something far more than they had bargained for. Their legacy isn't just supernatural abilities or cursed bloodlines. It's a transformation of human civilization itself, guided by intelligences that view individual human lives as components in a much larger design. And in the depths of the ancient mountains, where it all began, something vast and patient continues to grow, spreading its influence through fiber optic cables and genetic modifications, through financial algorithms and medical breakthroughs, through every innovation that humanity celebrates as progress towards a better future. The bargains were just the beginning. These five families discovered that in the ancient hills of Appalachia, some debts are paid in blood, and some bargains bind not just the living, but generations yet unborn. The Holloways, Carvers, Lowells, Thorntons, and Whitakers each found prosperity beyond their wildest dreams, but at a cost that grows heavier with each passing year. Their stories remind us that in the deepest hollows, where the mist never fully lifts, the old ways still whisper to those desperate enough to listen. The mountains remember every deal, every drop of blood, every promise made in darkness, and they are always ready to collect what is owed.